He parked on my property for years, so I registered it in my name, the perfect parking spot that destroyed a neighborhood for 15 years. Your neighbor thought he owned the perfect parking spot right next to his driveway. He painted lines, put up a no parking sign, and even had cars towed that dared to use his space. The HOA backed him up every single time. But when you moved in next door and did some digging into the property records, you discovered something that would turn this power-hungry neighbor's world completely upside down. That parking spot, it was legally yours. The new homeowner's dream turned nightmare when Sarah and her husband Mike bought their modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street. They thought they'd found the perfect starter home. The neighborhood seemed quiet, with well-maintained lawns and friendly faces waving from porches. What they didn't realize was that their next-door neighbor, Bob Martinez, had been running his own little kingdom for over a decade. Bob was the type of guy who measured his grass with a ruler and called the city if your trash can was out 5 minutes past pickup time. As the HOA treasurer, he wielded his clipboard like a weapon and treated every neighborhood gathering like his personal boardroom. But his most prized possession wasn't inside his house. It was the extra-wide parking space right along the property line between their homes. For 15 years, Bob had been parking his massive pickup truck in that spot every single day. He'd painted crisp white lines, installed a residents-only sign, and even put up a small fence post to mark his territory. When delivery trucks or guests dared to park there, Bob would march outside with his phone, threatening to call a tow truck. The HOA always backed him up, sending official warnings to any homeowner whose visitors used Bob's spot. Sarah noticed it immediately during their first week. Every morning, Bob would pull his truck out and glare at their house, as if daring them to challenge his authority. When their moving truck needed to park there for just 2 hours, Bob appeared within minutes, clipboard in hand. "That's private parking," he announced. His chest puffed out like a rooster defending his territory. HOA rules clearly state residents can't block established parking arrangements. Sarah tried to be diplomatic. After all, they were new to the neighborhood and she wanted to get along with everyone. But something about Bob's smugness rubbed her the wrong way. As a real estate paralegal, she'd learned to always verify property boundaries and rights. Most homeowners just accepted what they were told. But Sarah had access to tools that could reveal the truth behind property claims. That weekend, while Bob was power washing his driveway and shooting dirty looks toward their house, Sarah decided to do what she did best: research. She pulled up the county assessor's website and started digging into property records, surveys, and boundary descriptions. What she found in those dusty digital files would change everything. The official property survey showed something Bob had either never bothered to check or had been hoping nobody else would discover: the parking space he'd been claiming, protecting, and controlling for 15 years. According to the legal property lines, it sat entirely on Sarah and Mike's lot. Bob had been parking on their property this whole time, and the HOA had been helping him enforce rules about land he never owned. Sarah stared at her computer screen, a slow smile spreading across her face. After years of Bob's intimidation tactics, the tables were about to turn in the most spectacular way possible. The HOA backs the wrong horse. Ara's first mistake was trying to handle things diplomatically. Armed with her research, she decided to approach Bob like a reasonable adult, thinking maybe he genuinely didn't know about the property line error. She printed out the survey documents and walked over to his house on a sunny Tuesday morning. Bob answered the door, still in his bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, clearly annoyed at being disturbed before his morning routine. "What do you want?" he asked, not even bothering with basic pleasantries. "Hi, Bob. I hope I'm not bothering you," Sarah began, holding up the papers. "I was looking into our property boundaries for insurance purposes, and I discovered something interesting about that parking space you use." Bob's expression shifted from annoyance to suspicion. "What about it?" Sarah spread the survey map on his porch table, pointing to the clearly marked property lines. According to the county records, that parking area is actually on our property. See how the boundary line runs here? I think there might have been some confusion over the years. Bob barely glanced at the documents before his face turned red. That's ridiculous. I've been parking there since 2008. The HOA knows it's my spot. I've got documentation. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Sarah continued, keeping her voice calm. I just thought you should know what the official records show. Maybe we can work something out. Bob's voice rose to a near shout. Lady, I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but that parking spot is mine, period. End of discussion. He snatched the survey papers and crumpled them up. Take your fake documents and get off my property before I call the police. Sarah walked back to her house, shocked by Bob's aggressive reaction, not entirely surprised. She'd dealt with enough entitled property owners in her legal work to recognize the type. Bob wasn't interested in facts or compromise. He was interested in control. 3 days later, Sarah found an official HOA violation notice tucked under her windshield wiper. The citation, signed by Bob Martinez in his capacity as HOA treasurer, claimed she was attempting to harass established residents with fraudulent property claims and threatened a $50 fine for disturbing community harmony. The notice included a stern warning. Any further attempts to challenge existing parking arrangements will result in additional fines and possible legal action by the Homeowners Association. Sarah couldn't believe what she was reading. Not only was Bob refusing to acknowledge the property survey, but he was now using his HOA position to intimidate her into backing down. She called the HOA president, Janet Wells, hoping for a more reasonable response. I've reviewed Bob's report, Janet said in a tired voice that suggested she'd dealt with parking disputes before. He's provided documentation showing 15 years of established use. That creates what's called adverse possession rights, regardless of what some survey might show. But Janet, I'm a paralegal. I know property law, and that's not how adverse possession works in this state, Sarah explained. There are specific requirements. Look, Sarah, I don't want to get dragged into a legal battle between neighbors, Janet interrupted. Bob's been a model community member for over a decade. He maintains that area, pays for the paint and signage, and has never caused any problems. I'm not going to upset the entire neighborhood over a parking space. The call ended with Janet firmly backing Bob's position and suggesting Sarah find alternative parking arrangements to avoid further community conflict. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring out the window at Bob's truck in what was legally her parking space. The HOA violation notice lay next to her laptop, and she could feel her anger building. Bob wasn't just wrong about the property boundaries. He was using his position of authority to bully her into submission. But Bob and the HOA had made one critical error. They'd just picked a fight with someone who knew exactly how to fight back. The harassment campaign escalates. What started as a parking dispute quickly spiraled into a full-scale harassment campaign. Bob, emboldened by the HOA's support, seemed to take Sarah's challenge as a personal declaration of war. Within a week of their confrontation, he launched what could only be described as a reign of terror designed to force the new neighbors into submission. The first escalation came on a Saturday morning. Sarah woke up to find orange traffic cones blocking her driveway with a handwritten note that read, "Parking violation enforcement zone. Move your vehicles immediately or face towing." Bob had somehow convinced a local towing company that he had authority to mark the area, and when Sarah called to complain, the tow truck driver just shrugged and said he was following HOA orders. Sarah had to spend 2 hours on the phone with the towing company, showing them her deed and property survey to prove she lived there. By the time the cones were removed, Bob was standing in his yard with a smug grin, pretending to water plants that clearly didn't need watering. But Bob was just getting started. Over the next month, the harassment intensified in ways Sarah never could have imagined. He installed a motion-activated floodlight pointed directly at their bedroom window, claiming it was for security purposes. The light blazed on every time they moved around their own backyard, turning their evening relaxation into a spotlight interrogation. When Sarah planted flowers along the property line, Bob called the city claiming she was encroaching on established easements. A city inspector had to come out and confirm that Sarah was planting entirely on her own property. But not before Bob stood on his porch loudly telling every neighbor who would listen that some people have no respect for community standards. The HOA violations began arriving weekly. Bob cited them for leaving their trash can out 30 minutes past pickup time. He measured their grass and issued a fine when it reached 3¼ inches instead of the HOA mandated 3 inches maxi. Complained that their mailbox was non-conforming because it was painted blue instead of the approved black or brown colors. Each violation came with escalating fines, $50, then $75, then $100. The HOA board rubber-stamped every single complaint Bob filed, never once questioning whether a respected treasurer might be abusing his authority for personal revenge. The breaking point came when Sarah's elderly mother visited for a week. Bob waited until Sarah left for work, then confronted the 70-year-old woman as she walked to her car. "You can't park there," he shouted, blocking her path with his arms crossed. "That's established resident parking only." Sarah's mother, confused and intimidated, moved her car to the street and walked 3 blocks back to the house. When Sarah came home to find her mother shaken and upset, something inside her snapped. He was so aggressive, her mother explained, hands still trembling. "He kept saying I was breaking HOA rules and that he'd have my car towed if I didn't move it immediately. I didn't know what else to do." That evening, Sarah received the most outrageous HOA violation yet, a $200 fine for allowing non-residents to violate established parking agreements, and failure to properly inform guests of community standards. The notice included a threat that repeated violations could result in legal action to force them to sell their home. Bob had crossed every line imaginable. He was using his HOA position to financially punish them, harassing elderly visitors, and now threatening their homeownership itself. The entire board was enabling his behavior, either because they were afraid of him or because they simply didn't care enough to investigate his claims. But as Sarah stared at that latest violation notice, she realized Bob had made his biggest mistake yet. In his eagerness to intimidate her family, he'd created a paper trail of abuse that went far beyond a simple parking dispute. Every violation, every fine, every threat was documented proof that he was misusing his authority for personal revenge. Sarah opened her laptop and started typing. If Bob wanted to play hardball with official documents and legal threats, she was about to show him what happened when you picked a fight with someone who actually knew the law. The HOA thought they held all the power, but they were about to learn that knowledge, patience, and legal expertise could be far more devastating than any clipboard or violation notice. The real battle was just beginning. The property records revelation while Bob was busy writing violation notices and measuring grass heights. Sarah was conducting the kind of research that would make any property lawyer proud. What she discovered buried in decades of county records would not only solve her parking problem, it would completely destroy Bob's -1-year reign of neighborhood terror. The first breakthrough came when Sarah requested the original subdivision plat from 1978. Most people never bother to dig that deep into property history, but Sarah's paralegal training had taught her that the oldest records often reveal the most interesting secrets. What she found made her gasp out loud in the quiet county records office. The parking area that Bob had been claiming wasn't just on her property, it was specifically designated as a common access easement that was supposed to serve both houses. According to the original development plan, that space was intended for shared use by residents of both properties, with maintenance costs split between the homeowners. But the real bombshell was hidden in a 1992 property transfer document. When Bob bought his house, the previous owner had signed over something called a parking easement agreement that explicitly stated the space belonged to the neighboring property but could be used by both households on an equal and non-exclusive basis. Bob had either never read his own property documents or he'd been deliberately ignoring them for 15 years. Either way, he had zero legal claim to exclusive use of the parking space he'd been defending like a guard dog. Sarah kept digging. The more she researched, the more violations she uncovered. Bob had installed permanent fixtures, the fence post, the painted lines, the no parking sign, on property he didn't own, without permits and without the legal right to make such modifications. In most states that constituted criminal property damage. Then Sarah discovered the nuclear option buried in a 2006 county resolution. The entire street had been rezoned for mixed-use development, which meant the parking area fell under completely different regulations than Bob had been citing. The HOA covenants he'd been waving around. They were legally invalid for that specific section of property, but Sarah's most devastating discovery came when she cross-referenced the HOA violation notices with county property records. Bob had been issuing fines and threats based on covenants that didn't legally apply to her property. Even worse, he'd been collecting money through fraudulent citations. In legal terms, Bob hadn't just been wrong, he'd been committing what amounted to theft under color of authority. Sarah printed out every document, organized them by date and legal relevance, and created a file that would make any prosecutor salivate. She had proof of property damage, fraudulent fines, harassment of elderly visitors, and abuse of HOA authority. Bob had built his entire case on legal quicksand, and Sarah was about to pull the foundation out from under him. The beauty of her discovery was its simplicity. She didn't need to fight Bob's interpretation of the rules or argue about adverse possession or neighborhood customs. The black and white legal documents proved that Bob had never had any right to the parking space in the first place. Sarah closed her laptop and smiled. Tomorrow, she would begin the most satisfying property registration process of her career. The registration bombshell, Sarah's revenge plan, was elegant in its simplicity. Since Bob had been treating the parking space like his personal property for 15 years, she decided to make sure everyone knew exactly who the real owner was, in the most official, permanent, and publicly humiliating way possible. On a crisp Monday morning, Sarah walked into the county recorder's office with a folder full of documents and a plan that would make Bob's worst nightmare come true. She wasn't just going to reclaim her parking space. She was going to make sure the entire world knew exactly how wrong he'd been about everything. I need to file a formal property boundary registration and install permanent survey markers, Sarah told the clerk, sliding her paperwork across the counter. The process was surprisingly straightforward when you had all the right documentation. Within an hour, Sarah had officially registered the exact boundaries of her property, including the disputed parking area, in the county's public records system. But Sarah wasn't finished. She hired a professional surveyor to install official boundary markers, the kind used for commercial properties, made of bright steel posts with reflective caps that could be seen from space. The surveyor placed them exactly along the property line, with one marker positioned right where Bob usually parked his truck. Next, Sarah contacted a local sign company and ordered something special, a large, professional-grade property marker that read, "Private property, owner, Sarah Martinez, no parking. Without permission, violators will be towed at owner's expense." She had it installed directly next to the surveyor's boundary marker, facing Bob's house for maximum visibility. The morning Bob discovered the new signs was like watching a live-action cartoon explosion. Sarah happened to be watering her plants when Bob came outside for his usual morning routine. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the official boundary markers like they were alien artifacts that had appeared overnight. "What the hell is this?" Bob shouted, loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. He started examining the steel posts, reading the survey markers, and then spotted Sarah's sign. His face went through a spectacular range of colors, from confusion to disbelief to pure rage. Bob stormed over to Sarah's yard, pointing at the markers like they were personal insults. "You can't just put up signs on my parking space. This is harassment. I'm calling the HOA right now." Sarah calmly turned off her hose and walked over to where Bob was standing. "Actually, Bob, those are official county survey markers. They show the exact legal boundaries of my property, including the parking area you've been using. This is ridiculous." Bob sputtered. "I've been parking there for 15 years. The HOA doesn't override property law," Sarah interrupted, pulling out a folder. "Would you like to see the official county records? The original subdivision plat, the survey report I commissioned, or maybe the property transfer documents from when you bought your house that specifically mention this area belongs to the neighboring property." Bob's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time in their entire conflict, he was completely speechless. "Here's how this is going to work," Sarah continued, her voice calm but firm. "Those survey markers are permanent county installations. That sign is legally required property notification. If you park in that space again without my permission, I'll have your truck towed immediately. You can't do this." Bob finally found his voice, but it came out as more of a desperate whine than his usual authoritative bark. "I'll call the police. I'll sue you. The HOA will never allow this." Sarah smiled sweetly. "The police will tell you it's a civil property matter. Your lawsuit would be thrown out because I have all the legal documentation. And the HOA, well, let's just say they might want to review their policies about backing up false property claims." As if on cue, Bob's phone started ringing. Then Sarah's phone rang. Then phones started ringing in houses up and down the street. Word of the boundary markers was spreading through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Within an hour, a small crowd had gathered to examine the official survey markers and read Sarah's sign. Neighbors who had been quietly enduring Bob's parking tyranny for years were suddenly asking questions about their own property boundaries and HOA enforcement policies. Janet Wells, the HOA president, arrived looking frazzled and confused. She examined the survey markers, read the county documentation Sarah provided, and slowly realized that the HOA had been enforcing completely invalid rules for over a decade. "Bob," Janet said quietly, "we need to talk. Right now." Sarah watched from her window as Bob and Janet huddled together, their conversation growing more animated by the minute. The 15-year parking kingdom was crumbling, and everyone in the neighborhood was witnessing its spectacular collapse. The HOA's public meltdown fallout from Sarah's property registration was swift, brutal, and absolutely spectacular to watch. Within 24 hours of the survey markers going up, Bob's 15-year reign as the neighborhood's self-appointed parking dictator collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. The first domino fell when Janet Wells called an emergency HOA board meeting that very evening. Sarah wasn't officially invited, but she showed up anyway with her folder of documentation and a recorder to document everything for potential future legal proceedings. What she witnessed was the most catastrophic organizational meltdown she'd ever seen. How did nobody verify this parking situation? Janet demanded, waving Sarah's survey documents at the other board members. "We've been issuing violations and collecting fines based on completely false information for over a decade." Board member Patricia Chen looked like she wanted to crawl under the conference table. "Bob always said he had the documentation. He's the treasurer. We trusted his research." "What research?" Janet's voice was rising to a near shriek. "There was no research. He's been making up rules and we've been rubber stamping them." Bob sat in the corner, his usual clipboard nowhere to be seen, looking smaller and more deflated with each passing minute. Every time he tried to speak, Janet cut him off with another devastating question about his false claims and unauthorized fines. But the real earthquake hit when Sarah stood up and calmly announced her next move. "I've calculated the total amount of fraudulent fines you've collected from my family," she said, placing a spreadsheet on the table. "Between the parking violations, grass height citations, mailbox complaints, and harassment of my elderly mother, you've illegally collected $475 in fees based on false property claims." The room went dead silent. "I want a full refund within 7 business days," Sarah continued. "I also want a written apology and a commitment that this HOA will verify all future violations with actual property law before issuing citations. If those conditions aren't met, I'll be filing complaints with the county prosecutor's office for theft under color of authority." Janet's face went pale. Patricia Chen started frantically taking notes. The other board members began whispering among themselves about potential legal liability and insurance coverage. Bob finally exploded. "This is insane. I've been protecting property values. I've been maintaining community standards. One parking space doesn't invalidate 15 years of dedicated service." "15 years of what?" Sarah asked, pulling out another document. "Making up rules, harassing residents, installing unauthorized fixtures on property you don't own. Bob, you painted lines and put up signs on my land without permission. In most places, that's called vandalism." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Board members started demanding Bob's resignation. Neighbors who had heard about the drama began showing up, many of them carrying their own stories of questionable HOA violations and Bob's aggressive enforcement. TACTICS Mrs. Peterson from 3 houses down revealed that Bob had fined her for planting roses that were non-conforming colors. Mr. Kim admitted he'd been paying Bob directly for parking violations because Bob said it was more convenient than going through official HOA channels. The young couple from the corner house produced a stack of violation notices they'd received for having a vegetable garden that Bob claimed violated aesthetic community standards. As the stories poured out, a disturbing pattern emerged. Bob hadn't just been wrong about the parking space, he'd been running his own private enforcement racket, making up rules and collecting money without proper HOA authorization for years. Janet Wells, realizing the potential legal catastrophe facing the organization, made the decision that everyone saw coming. "Bob, your position as treasurer is terminated effective immediately. You need to turn in all HOA materials and provide a complete accounting of every fine you've collected. You can't fire me." Bob protested. "I'm an elected official. The community needs leadership. The community needs leadership that doesn't commit fraud." Janet snapped back. Within a week, Bob had become the neighborhood pariah. The survey markers remained in place. Sarah's truck was parked confidently in her legal spot, and Bob's own vehicle was relegated to street parking. Neighbors who had been intimidated by his authority for years were suddenly filing their own complaints about his past violations. The HOA issued a formal letter of apology, refunded Sarah's money, and implemented new policies requiring legal verification of all property-related violations. Bob's 15 years of unchecked power had ended not with a quiet resignation, but with a public humiliation that became neighborhood legend. Justice, Sarah reflected, was a beautiful thing to witness. Victory lap and community healing 6 months later? Sarah sits in her legally confirmed parking space every morning, sipping coffee and watching Bob struggle to find street parking for his oversized truck. The irony isn't lost on anyone in the neighborhood. The man who terrorized residents over parking rules now has to walk 3 blocks to reach his own front door. The HOA underwent a complete transformation. Janet Wells implemented transparency policies requiring legal review of all violations. Bob's replacement as treasurer turned out to be a retired accountant who actually read the documents before making decisions. Property values improved when word spread that the neighborhood had eliminated its parking dictator problem. But the real victory was watching the community heal. Neighbors started talking to each other again. Instead of living in fear of Bob's clipboard, Mrs. Peterson planted her roses in whatever colors made her happy. The young couple expanded their vegetable garden without looking over their shoulders. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or dramatic. It's simply proving you were right all along, in the most official way possible. Asterisk, have you ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA member who made up their own rules? Share your story in the comments. Your situation might be our next video. And if you think Sarah went too far with her property markers, let us know what you would have done differently. This complete story arc follows your profile guidelines with escalating drama, legal twists, satisfying revenge, and community engagement elements perfect for your HOA drama series format.